In 1928, a group of people gathered in a house, and Jesus gave them a dream to create a church that would become a force of transformation in their community. And that church has gone through various names: Alliance Tabernacle, Hillsdale Alliance Church, Living Hope Alliance Church. But it is a dream that has made a difference in the city, that has impacted people all around, changing this landscape of our city. How did that happen? How did a dream go from being just a dream in 1928 to a reality in the decades that followed? And how did this group of people lead a movement that would change a city? But even more importantly, how do we take that dream and own it in our own generation? You know, last week we started a series called More Than a Dream. And this series is examining a dream, a vision that Jesus gave to a man named John in Revelation chapter 7. It is this glorious vision of people of every nation, every tribe, every people group, every dialect, every language, gathered around the throne of Jesus, worshiping him together. It is this dream of an expansive kingdom of Jesus where no one is left out, everyone is known. It is inclusive of all people. And it is a vision of a kingdom that is ever expanding, that is growing even to this very day. And you know, it is a beautiful picture that we talked about last week, that Jesus wants us to bring into our life. And as long as we keep this Revelation 7 vision in front of us, we can begin to move towards that dream, towards that vision that Jesus gave to this man named John. But what is it that you and I need to do? You see, 2,000 years have passed since that vision was given. And yet when I look around at the church, when I look around at the world today, I don't see that vision being a reality. I don't see our churches being a vision of that worship service around the throne. And I certainly don't see at the end of the passage where Jesus points out to him, he says this, he says that those around the throne, that God is the shelter for them. You see, in the kingdom of Jesus, there's no homelessness. He says, never will they hunger again, never will they thirst. You see, poverty isn't a problem in the kingdom of Jesus. The sun will not be down on them, nor any scorching heat. You know, global warming isn't a problem in the kingdom of Jesus. The world is changed. People are not persecuted. And he says this, he says, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. You know, the kingdom of Jesus, as I read in Revelation 7, is significantly different than what I see today. And yet, Jesus' people who've been charged with this vision and to making the kingdom come in our day, to helping transform this world just as Jesus transformed this world when he walked on it, he's charged us to do the same. So why hasn't it happened? Why aren't we becoming more what Jesus envisions today than we were 2,000 years ago? That's what I want to talk to you about today. Last week we talked about how we need to keep this vision in front of us of Revelation 7, to always remember that this is what reality is, and we should be looking to make eternity the reality right now. You see, if that's where we're going to end up, then why wouldn't we want our lives to be like that today? And we need to keep that vision in front of us, but there are things that we have to do. You see, Jesus models for us a way of living that will make Revelation 7 a reality. And we need to step into what he envisions and the life that he calls us to have. If you have your Bibles, turn with me to Luke chapter 4. We're going to look at verses 14 to 30 this morning. You heard Colin read it this morning. Luke 4 is the story of Jesus returning to his hometown, to Nazareth. And he goes there on the Saturday, the Sabbath, and he goes to the synagogue and he's there to teach. And the whole town gathers to hear him. This is the hometown boy who's come home. They've heard lots of things about him, and they want to hear, you know, is he really as good? Can he really do the things that everybody has said that he can do? And he's handed a scroll, and the scroll opens by God's providence to Isaiah. And he reads these words, and you know, Luke 4:18 and 19 are often referred to as the mission statement of Jesus. that everything that he is going to do is accomplished, that he speaks about it before he actually does it. He says this, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoner and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And Jesus rolls up the scroll and he says, "This has been fulfilled here and now." You see, these verses are indeed the mission statement of what Jesus is going to do. And what happens in the passages that follow, if you keep reading, is you see that Jesus actually does everything that he says in that verse. That he heals people, he proclaims freedom for those who are oppressed. He declares that this is the year of the Lord's favor, when all debts, when all sins are forgiven. Jesus does exactly what he says. He has a very clear understanding of why he came. Think about this with me for a moment. You know, do you know any busy or important people in your life? What do they do when they see a problem? Or what do they do when something's going on around them? They delegate, don't they? I remember when COVID started and, they shut down everything, and then there came the Reopen Saskatchewan plan. Do you remember that day in April? And I remember reading that plan and seeing an absence of churches in that plan, any mention to what a church could do to reopen. And I remember sitting down right away and writing letters to our MLA, to our MP and our premier, to anybody that would listen, really. And a number of my friends also did the same thing. And in the weeks that followed, we got some notes back. The note to the premier, we didn't get the premier's signature on a letter back. It came from someone who was 2 or 3 levels below the premier. You see, what important people do is that they delegate. They send somebody else in their place, but not Jesus. Jesus in Luke 4:18, he says, "This is why I have come, to do all of these things." And Jesus, who is God, is a very important person, isn't he? Wouldn't you say? And yet he doesn't delegate this. He doesn't give it to someone else to do. Jesus actually shows up in creation to make a difference in the lives of a people who are broken. You see, Luke 4:18 and 19, those verses there, they describe you and me. This is our condition, that we are spiritually blind. We are oppressed. We are poor. We are in need of the forgiveness of our debts. You and I were born into sin. And no amount of good living, no matter how many good things that we do, will never reconcile us to a holy God who says that all have sinned. But instead of leaving us to our own devices or sending someone else to try and solve the problem, Jesus steps into creation and changes the world. Jesus shows up. Philippians 2, the author in that book, he says that Jesus actually gave up his divine privileges. Listen to what he writes. He says, Jesus, who being in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. You see, Jesus has all the powers, everything in the world, and yet he doesn't consider that all these powers that he has should be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing. One translation says he gave up his divine privilege. Gave up his divine privilege. There's been a lot of talk recently, hasn't there, about this word privilege? Whether it's white privilege or male privilege or Canadian privilege. I'm not going to talk about privilege, so don't get nervous right now. I recognize that all of us in this room and gathered around this stream right now, that we have varying levels of privilege. All of us have privilege. Here's what I want you to understand, that Jesus, who had all privileges, gave up his divine privileges. He made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness and being found in appearance as a man. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. You see, Jesus gives up his divine privilege in order to change the world. What is it that you need to give up to change your world? We all have things in our life, powers and privileges. Some we're born with, some have more than others. And what is it that Jesus is calling you to give up today in order to be able to show up and change the world? You see, often the things that we cling to keep us from actually making the change that Jesus wants us to bring into this world. And we need to give things up. We need to humble ourselves like a servant. Jesus didn't dictate terms from on high. He stepped into this creation, into this life. He showed up. And you and I, we need to begin showing up in the problems of this world. We need to have an understanding of why we are here in the first place. It is not to have a comfortable living. It is not to go on the next vacation. It is to transform this world. You see, when you commit to following Jesus Christ, you commit to dying to self. You commit to making Philippians 2 your story, just as it is Jesus' story. To giving up everything in pursuit of Jesus, in pursuit of making his vision of the world a reality today. And friends, I think we need to begin showing up. Begin showing up consistently every single day in the problems of this world. You know, oftentimes we write a check to a homeless shelter, right? And we say that I'm showing up. And then we walk out the door and we respond negatively to someone who looks very different than us. Friends, we need to show up consistently. We walk down the street after attending a protest, and we walk right by a homeless person and do nothing. Friends, we need to show up consistently, just as Jesus showed up consistently. Jesus shows up in his hometown. He goes to Nazareth. You know, Jesus at this point had been in other places, but he returns to his hometown. Why? Because the people of Nazareth need to have their world changed. And you know what? I think this teaches us something. Because oftentimes when we look at the problems of the world, we're really good at pinpointing the problems somewhere else and saying we need to do something to change that, or we need to change something over there. But Jesus starts in his own backyard in Nazareth. And we need to show up right here, right now, and make a difference. Yes, there are problems in Kenosha, in Minneapolis, in other parts of the world. But we need to begin showing up here and making a difference here in the lives of people who need to experience transformation just as we have. Are you showing up? Jesus showed up in creation to change the world. And he reads these verses from Isaiah, and he rolls up the scroll, and everybody sits there in silence, waiting for him to say something. And he knows what they're thinking. He says to them, "Surely you will quote this proverb to me, 'Physician, heal yourself.' And you will tell me, 'Do here in your hometown what we have heard you did in Capernaum.'" You see, the people have come, and they've come to the synagogue because they heard Jesus was there, but they're not really interested in what Jesus has to say. All they really want to experience is the miracles of Jesus. Jesus came to change their world, but all that they are interested in is having life a little bit easier than it was before. You see, there's something we need to realize. Jesus reads these words from Isaiah, and you know what's featured in these words? The word proclaim. It never says that he's going to come and he's going to heal everyone. It never says that he's going to come and solve poverty. He does those things. But they all flow out of the proclamation that comes first. And you see, friends, we need to show up. But we need to show up with the gospel. You know, as Christians, I think sometimes we swing on a pendulum. We swing on a pendulum between social justice, doing all of these great things, and proclamation. And sometimes this pendulum that we swing between circles around generations. And sometimes one generation is more concerned about proclamation and another is more concerned about social justice. But friends, what we see in Jesus is actually both are together. But proclamation precedes anything to do with social justice. For many years, we've misquoted a guy who I think would be a little upset that we've misquoted him. We've said this: preach the gospel at all times, and when necessary, use words. And I think the guy that's misquoted for saying that, he never would have said anything like that. Because if you look at his life, he preached the gospel with words, and he followed that up with deeds. And we need to stop this swinging back and forth, and we need to bring our whole self and the whole gospel into everything we do. You see, the gospel is this: that you can be reconciled to God, that you were born into sin, but you can be reconciled with God. You can be forgiven, and you can become who you were created to be. This is the gospel. And it is centered around the person and the work of Jesus Christ, not the work that you or I do, but the work of Jesus Christ. But when we encounter the gospel and when we take it into ourselves, it transforms us. We talked a little bit about this last week as we talked about those who were gathered around the throne were those who had washed their robes in the blood of the Lamb. They had been transformed by their interaction with Jesus. And friends, you see, social justice flows out of the gospel. It is not the gospel. The gospel is that Jesus saves by faith alone. And when we are truly transformed, we cannot walk by a homeless person without doing something about it. We cannot see injustice on television or in front of us and not do something about it. Because the gospel so takes root in our soul that it changes the way that we think. So that, just as Chandra walked by the mess in the video, right? That we cannot walk by the messes in this world without doing something about it, without bringing the whole gospel that Jesus saves, that Jesus is the solution. And we are here to tell you about it, but also to walk with you and to help you change the world. We need to show up consistently, and we need to show up with the whole gospel, because then the world will be changed. And the crowd doesn't react well to Jesus. They're not too happy with him. They start to criticize him. And then Jesus kind of says something that's a little odd. He talks about two men, Elijah and Elisha. And he says, I assure you that there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's time when the sky was shut for 3.5 years and there was a severe famine throughout the land. Yet Elijah was not sent to any of them, but to the widow in Zarephath in the region of Sidon. And there were many in Israel with leprosy in the time of Elisha, the prophet, yet none of them was cleansed, only Nahum, the Syrian. And I think there's two things that Jesus reveals to us through this kind of weird response. He talks about two prophets who were sent to be prophets to the nation of Israel. They were meant to change a nation. And yet the stories that we have and the focus of the scriptures about them focuses on their interactions not with a nation as much as it is with a person, the widow in Zarephath, who Elijah's life changed. Nahum, his relationship with Elisha changed his life. And you see, the people of Israel at the time of Elijah and Elisha, they weren't interested. And so God led these two men to other people who desperately needed their life transformed and who were interested in the kingdom of God. And sometimes I think that we have this tendency to lean into the hard cases in life, don't we? That when someone resists, we show up and we bring the whole gospel and someone is resistant to that, that we just kind of say, well, I just need to lean in a little harder. But I think this passage teaches us something else, and I think the life of Jesus teaches us something else as well. You see, this passage says, let God lead you to the people whose lives he wants you to change. And this gives us permission to move on from the hard cases and to go where the Spirit leads and not just hang in there. That's the first thing, is sometimes the Spirit leads us away from where we thought we would actually be making a difference. And the second thing is that the Spirit always leads us to where a world can be transformed. You see, Jesus is transforming the world. This is the story of the gospel, that he will transform, and he chooses to invite us into his mission. It's his mission. Never forget that. It is not your mission. It is his. And he chooses to use us to let us help him in that mission. And because it is his mission, he has someone for each one of us who he wants to make a difference in, whose world he wants to bring transformation to. If you look at this passage, Jesus talks about Elijah and Elisha and their influence on one people. If you look at the life of Jesus, sure, he is surrounded by crowds, but he touches individuals. He touches individuals. He heals one person. Jesus walks up to a crowd of people who desperately need healing, and we're told he heals one person. And Jesus sets an example for us. You see, sometimes the problems in this world can seem so daunting we don't know where to turn or how to begin. But Jesus models a life that focuses on one. In the midst of all the problems that were going on in the first century, there are only so many people who Jesus touched. And friends, I think he wants us to touch one person. That in the middle of injustice and poverty, racism and all the other problems in the world, that Jesus wants us to show up consistently. Jesus wants us to show up with the full gospel, to proclaim the gospel and let everything else flow out of it. And he wants us to show up and start with one person. I think Jesus has someone for you that he wants you to work with, that he wants you to bring the full gospel to. And the Spirit will lead you to that person. And the world will be changed. You know, imagine what might happen if all of us began to do that. If all of us did for one what we wished we could do for the whole world. Imagine what might happen. The 500 people watching this stream, everyone chose one. All of a sudden, there's another 500 lives that are transformed. And if they would just touch one and we would move on to another one, imagine the exponential growth that will happen over time as we start with just one, as Elijah did, as Elisha did, as Jesus models for us. And we begin to show up consistently, bringing the full gospel in the life of the one that Jesus leads us to. So what do you and I need to do in response today? Maybe it's time for you to start showing up. Maybe you get riled up when you see something on TV, but then it dissipates with the next news cycle. And maybe that discontent that you feel, maybe you need to come to Jesus with that discontent and stop just letting it dissipate, but listen to what Jesus wants you to do in this moment. Maybe there's a situation where you've been bringing the help, but not the whole gospel. And maybe it's time to bring them back together and to show to the people around you and to the world that the gospel transforms us and everything else flows out of that. Or maybe there's someone that Jesus is leading you to today. Here's what we're going to do. For the next 3 minutes, we're just going to hit pause on your day, on everything else that's going on, and we're going to listen to the Spirit. The music is going to play silently underneath. And I want you to listen to what the Spirit has to say to you today around two questions. The first question is just this: Jesus, where do you want me to start showing up? Listen to what he has to say to you, because it's his mission and he has a place for you in it. And then, Jesus, who are you sending me to? Who is the one who you want me to come? You know, friends, this world will not change until you and I begin showing up. Until you and I begin following Jesus and his example, because he showed up and he's waiting for you to do the same. Let's listen to the Spirit this morning around these two questions.